Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me, please? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you, Joel.
Sure. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening once again to the second in the series of three-part webinars on the theme Libraries in Development, Advancing Library Visibility in Africa. Last week, for those of you who attended, you recall that our webinar one was on development organizations interview, perceptions and possibilities for African libraries. And one of the key issues that came up was this, that we need to, as a matter of fact, continue to advocate for libraries in Africa, all types of libraries, and also to network and not to work in silos. For this morning, this afternoon, this evening session, our sub-team is on library survey, current data practices in African libraries. This webinar will basically present findings from the development stories, a work stream of the ALVA project. And the findings will be at two levels. One, to present to you what's the current practices in data collection, data use, and data sharing in African libraries, and also the current needs for data support. The presentation will also look at the connections between library data and what development organizations want. Let me mention that this webinar is being streamed live on Facebook. At the end of the day, the presentations will be made available to participants and non-participants alike. Please feel free as the presentation goes on to put in your questions, your suggestions, your comments to help us in this exercise. To help us do this work will be two resource persons from Tasha. Renee Lynch, a PhD candidate in English who has been on this project for the past 2 years. She's a research associate of Tasha. And then Dr. Jason Young. Hi, Jason. He's been with us since 2017 on this project, and he's a senior research scientist at the Information School of the University of Washington in Seattle, USA. Ladies and gentlemen, without wasting much time, may I invite Dr. Young and Renee to present the findings to us.
Wonderful, thank you, Joel. Hello and welcome to the second, as Dr. Sam mentioned, the second of our three-part webinar series presented by the Advancing Library Visibility in Africa, or ALVA project. Today's webinar, as Dr. Sam mentioned, is titled Library Survey. Let me actually start the presentation. There we go. Library Survey, Current Data Practices in African Libraries. In this webinar, we will share the results of a survey that we administered across the continent to determine trends in how library systems collect and use data. We will also examine how the current data collected by libraries compare with the data that development organizations desire when making partnership and funding decisions. Our goal with this presentation is to highlight how libraries might change their current data collection and use practices to be more competitive for funding from these development organizations based on the information that we discussed last week, which provided us information on what development organizations are looking for in their decision-making processes. As always, a big thanks to all of you for taking your time to listen in, and we really hope you find something useful to take away from today's talk. As was mentioned, my name is Jason Young, and I'm a senior research scientist at the Technology and Social Change Group, or TASHA, within the University of Washington's Information School in Seattle, Washington, USA. I'm also one of the lead researchers on the ALVA project. Today, I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Renee Lynch. Renee, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you again. My name is Renee Lynch. I'm a research associate on the ALVA Advancing Library Visibility in Africa project, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Washington in Seattle.
Thanks, Renee. And then, of course, and many of you are joining us from last week, so this will be a bit of a review for you, but I want to make sure if we have anybody new that we have all the background on the project. So, of course, the material in this presentation reflects the work not just of Renee and myself, but rather we're representing the ALVA project, which is a partnership between AFLIA and TASHA and supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This project was created in response to a gap that we collectively identified in relation to the role of libraries across the African continent. On the one hand, we find that libraries are very active in supporting sustainable development in their own communities and countries. On the other hand, they're rarely recognized for this work, especially by the international development organizations that are doing very similar projects. Our goal is to reverse this by demonstrating to development organizations that they should be funding and partnering with libraries to achieve mutual development goals. Some of the other researchers involved in this project include Dr. Joel Sam of AFLIA, Stanley Boache Achampong of AFLIA, Chris Joasis at TASHA, and Bree Norlander at TASHA. We've also been supported by incredible library champions across the continent, and I'm sure many of those champions are here in the audience today, so I thank you all for being here. I'm constantly grateful for these partnerships, since it is only by working together that we can truly make the great work of libraries more visible across the African continent. So, what are we covering today? Here's an overview of today's webinar. I will start by providing you with a brief reminder of some of ALVA's overall work, and this should be familiar to those of you that joined the webinar last week. From there, we'll shift to the new information, which includes results from a survey that we conducted with library systems across Africa. I will start by describing the survey method that we used, and then Renee and I will discuss some of the survey findings. We will then connect those findings to some of the recommendations that we made last week at the webinar. As a reminder, last week focused on understanding what data development organizations like to see when they are selecting partners. This survey essentially explores whether libraries currently do or could collect those data that development organizations want to see. We'll then end today's talk with questions and answers. So first, a reminder about the overall work of ALVA. Our primary goal at ALVA is to support libraries as lifelong partners to the development of communities and the continent of Africa. To achieve that goal, the project is focused on two primary work streams: library sites and development stories. These work streams correspond roughly to the steps we believe are necessary to get development organizations to start noticing the development work being done by libraries. Step one was to get development organizations to even recognize that libraries exist in the places where they work. The library sites workstream did this by literally putting libraries on a map. Through an innovative crowdsourcing project and support from our in-country champions, we have mapped 730 libraries across 27 countries. And you can see the map with the data of that work on your screen right there. Step two is to add more data about the libraries on the map to persuasively tell the story of why those libraries would make good partners to development organizations. Last week's webinar started that process by discussing the first stage of this effort. We interviewed development organization workers to determine what type of data they find to be persuasive when choosing partners. We found, for example, that they want quantitative data that describes the reach and impact of libraries. Today, we turn to the second stage, determining the capacity of library systems to collect and use those data. Questions that we'll explore include, are these systems already collecting the necessary data? If not, do African library systems have data collection processes in place that could be easily adjusted? What training or other support do libraries need to more effectively collect the data that development organizations are seeking out? These were the questions that we sought to answer through our survey. And really quickly, here's just some reminders of the key takeaways from last week's presentation. Things we talked about in terms of recommendations included having framing work in terms of connections to local community, attention to marginalized groups, and past successes in implementing programs, collecting quantitative data on library usage and other user demographics, collecting a variety of data if possible, and then continuing to network. For international audiences, promoting library strengths as community embedded institutions and hubs for development resources, including space, data, and research. Today, we're really focused on that second bullet point there. Are libraries collecting those quantitative data on library usage and as well as user demographics? And are you collecting a variety of data that might be adjusted for the purposes of kind of proving the impact you're having on sustainable development? So our survey, here's a description of the method that we used in order to carry out our survey. I would note at the outset that we originally had a slightly different plan. Rather than this survey, we were planning to actually travel to library systems across the African continent in person to interview staff about their data collection and use processes. We wanted to talk to national librarians about how they use data, to talk with local frontline librarians to see how they actually collect data on that front line, and more. That unfortunately didn't work out for us. The COVID-19 pandemic hit just as we started planning that stage of our work, causing us to change course. Instead, we chose to distribute a survey to public library systems, since that survey could be completed safely and remotely. The advantage of that approach was that we could get information from more countries than we could have visited even if we had gone with our original in-person plan. We invited 77 heads of library systems to participate in the study. Of those, 29 fully completed surveys. They represented all African regions. So we got responses from countries in the North, East, West, Central, and South African regions. They represented countries that spoke languages, including Arabic, English, French, and Portuguese. And they also represented libraries that were both centralized, so had a strong national library system centralized to the country, and decentralized countries, so some countries that have many different decentralized library systems. Each of those 29 responses reflects the practices of a whole library system. So in other words, we have 29 full library systems represented in our survey results. Note that because we have decentralized library systems represented, 29 responses is not 29 countries. Some of those responses are multiple from the same country because they're decentralized systems. So 19 countries represented in total. That survey was administered on a web-based survey platform called Qualtrics. And you can see there the image of a mobile device that has a screenshot of what the survey looked like to the participants in our survey. Because each survey represented an entire library system, we allowed multiple people from the library system to contribute answers across the 5 sections of questions. Those sections included one on data collection, one on data use, on data sharing, data use in decision making, and experiences with data collection. And we allowed multiple people to engage the survey because this was to recognize that different people may be in charge of these different aspects of data. So somebody may be the expert in data collection and somebody may be an expert in data use. Finally, we analyzed survey results using quantitative and qualitative methods. In this case, we use descriptive statistics to analyze the quantitative data or numerical data, and content analysis to analyze kind of open text qualitative responses. I'd emphasize that the results do not include all African countries, but we think that they still give us a very reasonable picture of what libraries are doing across the continent because we do have such good representation across the different regions, languages, and types of primary types of systems. So all of the analysis then allows us to discuss today these three large questions. What data do African libraries already have? What data practices are already in place? And what additional support might be needed so that library systems can make even more effective use of their data in accomplishing missions related to sustainable development? With that, I'll turn it over to Renee.
Thank you, Jason. At this point, Jason and I will walk through some of the findings that we got from both the open-ended and close-ended questions to this survey. Before we do that, I want to offer a quick thanks to the participants of this survey. If you're joining us on the webinar today, thank you very much for your efforts. It was quite an extensive survey, so we appreciate all of your time and effort to complete all of those questions. We'll be talking about the findings today in two major groups. The first major group of findings considers the current data practices of African library systems. And the second major group concerns the data needs, or what is needed in order to support those data practices and expand on them. So I'll be discussing the first major group, which is current data practices, and we'll be discussing data practices related to data collection, data use, and data sharing. Also, we'll be talking about the big picture or overall findings, and then giving some details from the survey that support that overall assertion. However, I will invite you to look at the full report, which gives all of the details of the survey. A link to that can be found on the last slide, and perhaps we can also share that in the chat as well, so that you can have access to the full information that we are summarizing the main findings of for today. So one of the first major findings was that library systems value data and collect it purposefully for a variety of reasons. This is an important finding because we found that library systems do see data as important, and in many cases do have established systems for collecting it, and are being influenced by various different uses or reasons for collecting that data. And I'll now present some details related to this. So this was in a response to a question about whether or not library systems value data relative to the amount of effort and time spent collecting that data. So all our participants, 29 of them, responded to this question. And as we can see, 19 of them reported that the value of data is extremely valuable, and 9 of them reported that data is moderately valuable. We only had one respond that the value of the data was neutral. So overall, this leads us to believe that library systems do see the value of data and collect it, knowing that that time and effort that is spent collecting it is serving some sort of purpose for their library system. Next, we asked about who is involved in collecting the data. This question, again, was answered by all of the respondents, 29 of them, and participants could select all answers that applied to their library system. This is important for us to know because in terms of changing practices or adjusting practices, these might be the groups of people that we would need to be working with or supporting in data collection practices. So as we can see here, 24 respondents reported that frontline staff are involved in data collection, which is the largest group represented across African library systems. And after that, managers are involved in the data collection for 21 of our respondents to the survey. Together, frontline staff and managers represent the largest proportion of library staff that are actually collecting the data, and to a lesser extent, the ministry, national librarian, and state librarians are also involved. And 4 respondents reported other or some other type of staff role was involved in collecting data. Importantly, we wanted to include the idea of whether or not training was available to data collectors and reporters prior to the data collection and reporting. So interestingly, 16, or I should say only 16 of the respondents, a total of 29, reported that training was available, which represents just about half or slightly over half of the respondents talking about training that is available for those who collect data. This is an idea that was woven throughout the survey results and something that we'll return to later. But overall, there is a need for more training and support in order to collect data more effectively. Next, I would like to talk about a more open-ended question. All 29 participants responded to this question, and it asked very broadly for the respondents to describe the entire data cycle from collection to analysis. So although all participants answered this question, they didn't all answer to the same degree of detail. So that should be taken into account here. However, in analyzing the results of that question, we found that generally the data cycles broke into 3 organizational patterns, and I'll describe those patterns and the proportion of respondents that fit into that category. So the most prevalent type of data pattern, or a pattern for the data cycle, was a hierarchical pattern, and 17 respondents, or 59% of the total, described a data cycle that fit into this pattern. The hierarchical pattern can be described as data which is collected at the library branches on a regular schedule and then passed up to a higher authority who compiles, analyzes, and submits the data to higher levels. We also see this echoed later when we talk to participants about how they verify the accuracy of data, and hierarchy was a common theme there as well. The second most prevalent theme was an independent organizational pattern for collecting and analyzing data, and 4 respondents, or 14% of the total, fit into this category. So this would be where libraries collect their own data and then may or may not share it for compilation or analysis at higher levels. This was certainly more common in those who discussed being part of a decentralized library system or a library system that is semi-autonomous and may not have a mandate from a national library to collect or share data. In some cases they would if they chose to, but if there was not a mandate, it made it less likely that there was a sharing with higher levels. And then last but not least, 2 respondents discussed having an issue-based data cycle, where first they identify an issue, have conversations with relative stakeholders, and then decide the collection method, the indicators, and the necessary training for collecting that data. So even though it's a small proportion, it's still a type of pattern that exists. And importantly, for 6 of the respondents, because of lack of detail in their answers, it was not possible to know or to determine what type of data cycle they had. So more details would be needed in future research there. So other common data practices that we found across the African library systems that we surveyed was the fact that many are legally required to collect operational and user data. This is interesting to us because operational and user data were also the most commonly collected types of data, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But as you can see here, of the 25 participants who responded to this question, 21 of them said that they are legally required to collect operational data, and 20 of them reported that they are legally required to collect user data. It's interesting here also to notice that 14 of them said that they are legally required to collect data that directly relate to development, related to the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals and NDPs or National Development Plans of their country. So this shows that development data is also a part of the common data practices. 2 reported that there are no legal mandates to collect any types of data, and 2 replied to say that there are other types of data that they are legally required to collect. So the fact that operational data and user data are the most commonly legally required leads us to believe that the main determiner of what data is collected is that mandate of a ministry or government authority. And this is important to know because it may not be within the purview or the agency of the library in order to change the types of data that they collect, and they may not have a lot of choice there. And that's something important to consider as we think about adjusting or adapting to current practices. Another common practice was that there is a lack of data verification processes for accuracy. So as we can see here, when we asked if the library uses a verification process for accuracy, 62% or 18 of the total 29 respondents to this question said no, there is no verification process for accuracy. For those who said yes, 11 participants, we asked them to describe the verification process that they use. And it was very common that many of them mentioned passing the data up to higher levels for approval. And that was how the data was verified or deemed accurate. Secondly, there were some practices involving proofreading, cross-checking, or trend analysis, which would compare a trend in data to a trend of the past year or the past quarter, perhaps, in order to see if it made sense. Also within that, a few participants mentioned sending their data externally, such as to a National Office of Statistics, in order to be verified by an external third party. And then 2 other common practices that we found from open-ended questions were issuing an annual report based on compiled data. So 7 respondents mentioned that they do issue an annual report based on data that they collect throughout the year. And we thought that this was important because it represents a product or a package of data that at least 7 respondents mentioned that they might already have available. So if that's something that could be made publicly available or could be worked within to attract a development organization, that's an important resource that we're aware of many libraries may have. And also, many library systems reported using a mixture of paper-based and electronic methods for data collection, data analysis, and so on. So this is important because any training should take into account that many systems are using this mixture, not strictly paper-based or strictly electronic, but that there's some variety in how African library systems are going about their data processes. Our next big picture finding, as I mentioned before, is in terms of the types of data that are collected. We found that most respondents collect operational and user data. These are the most commonly collected types of data among the African library systems that we surveyed. As you can see here on the figure, for the 29 participants who responded to this question about which types of data they collect, most collect operational and user data, with 26 participants responding for each of those respectively. So to a lesser extent, but still significant, many library systems also collect demographic data about their users. Demographic data including age, occupation, and other personal information about who is using the library. And then again, we see development data, SDGs and NDPs, being represented here in terms of the types of data that are collected, though to a lesser extent than operational and user data. And then 4 respondents said that there's other data that was not included in our survey that is regularly collected by their library system. When we asked more specifically about the types of operational data and the types of user data that are collected, we found that the top 5 most commonly collected types of operational data include the number of patrons of the library, the print material circulation, public internet in terms of if public internet is available at that library or not, the number of staff computers, and the public service hours of that library. And then beyond that, 81% of the library system surveyed report collecting demographic information about their users. So again, some examples that were given through the survey include age, gender, occupation, education level, and the purpose of the library visit. So together, these represent the types of data that libraries already have available to them and the types of data that we could reasonably work with in order to build a persuasive story about how libraries are currently involved in development, and also making that more visible with these data to development organizations. And I'll now turn it over to Jason to talk through the next set of our findings.
Great, thanks, Renee. So our third finding then is that for many library systems, data collection and use are consistently tied to both library advocacy as well as meeting the needs of library users. In other words, the library system would choose to collect data that are most useful for supporting their mission of building their own capacity through funding, for example, and also serving their patrons. That finding is evident in this graph, which displays responses to the question, how do you use the data you collect? Participants could select as many answers as they wanted to here. So you'll notice the numbers don't all add up to 29 because participants are selecting multiple answers. Most participants reported using data for operational purposes related to planning and budgeting. So you see 24 and 23 participants respectively said that they use data for those purposes. And so that's about 80% of respondents indicating that they use data for planning their activities or for budgeting. A substantial number of participants also use it to advocate for the library within their own government. And so that is 22 of our respondents. We then see a slight drop off for using data for purposes such as evaluation, monitoring, and external advocacy. That drop off in numbers wasn't particularly surprising to us. These types of activities, so evaluation, monitoring, and external advocacy, are all a bit more difficult in terms of types of activities, and they have less of an immediate need. So in other words, obviously day to day, you need that planning and budgeting in order to operate the library. But things like evaluation and monitoring may not happen on a day-to-day basis. Nevertheless, about 2/3 of our respondents indicated that they do use data for evaluation, monitoring, and external advocacy. Smaller numbers still indicated that they used data for goal setting. That was 18 respondents. And then 15 respondents indicated that they used data to evaluate their partnerships. 4 respondents had other uses for data. Another question asked participants to describe why they chose to collect the particular data variables that they do collect. Responses were once again driven by support for patrons and a need to acquire funding. So our participants indicated that they collect data in order to understand library usage and users. And this included activities such as assessing the needs of their users, as well as measuring library success in meeting those needs and identifying gaps where they aren't meeting the needs of their patrons. The respondents also talk quite a bit about demonstrating accountability. So in other words, these libraries had to advocate for government funding, and a requirement for getting and maintaining that funding was meeting the goals expressed within a strategic plan, for example, of the National Library. And so data are quite important for demonstrating that the library remains accountable to meeting those goals so that they can continue to get that funding to continue to meet those goals. Another question asks participants how data impact their policies, both at an internal and external level. 41% of participants report that they have made an internal policy change within the last 2 years due to data that they have collected. So in other words, some aspect of their operation, their day-to-day operations, have changed based on evidence presented to them through the data that they collect. 24% report some sort of external policy change. And so that is a change that is directed at how they interact externally with users or patrons of the library. It's notable here that both numbers are relatively low, so 41 and 24%, and external policy is lower than internal policy change. This may indicate that there is room to grow in terms of grounding decision-making around policy in data. And that's particularly the case when it comes to external organizations, which would include organizations like development organizations. So there may, in fact, be an opportunity here to increase the role that data play in driving policies towards interactions with development organizations, which is our topic today. And in fact, libraries do seem to recognize the importance of using data for soliciting that outside support. When asked how much of a role data play when soliciting support from government or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, participants overwhelmingly said that it played a positive role, ranging from a great deal of a role, so that was 14 respondents, down to a moderate role, which included 3 participants. 9 participants said it played quite a lot of a role. When asked what types of data have been most persuasive for those advocacy activities, there was a notable emphasis on quantitative or numerical data. For example, users often mention data on usage of library facilities, such as membership numbers in particular programs, or the number of computers offered to patrons in a particular facility. This is quite consistent with what we discussed in last week's webinar, that development organizations do in fact prefer those types of numerical or quantitative data. This shows that libraries are already engaging in data practices that are indeed valuable to development organizations, meaning that it may be relatively easy to shift to targeting these development organizations with monitoring or with messaging based on data that is already being used for advocacy. Also consistent with our discussion from last week, we found that very few participants mentioned impact data. So impact data are data that describe the impact that library activities are having on the wider community. Development organizations did indicate that they do want impact data that is very, very valuable, but they nevertheless find it often difficult to get that impact data from community partners. This could therefore be an opportunity for library systems to start collecting those data. These findings were similar regardless of whether participants were talking about advocacy with their own government or with external organizations. So in other words, they found that regardless of whether they're providing data to governments or to external, for example, NGOs, that numerical or quantitative data was important, and usage or facilities data was also kind of important in terms of being the most persuasive. The one difference that we found was that some participants highlighted challenges that they faced a bit more to those external organizations. As one respondent indicated, data on the limited resources available to them have allowed donors to provide some support to meet some needs. recognizing that this support in their country is very scarce. So in other words, that participant stressed their needs to these external organizations using data in order to get that external organization to provide support to overcome that local challenge. Other participants in the survey emphasized the importance of getting external support to build their own capacity within their libraries. More research is needed, but this may suggest an emphasis on presenting challenges or hardships to these external organizations. One thing to explore is that this may not be the most effective approach for some development organizations, since last week in our interviews, we found that these development organizations really emphasize the need for high capacity partners and are more interested in hearing about the strengths of organizations like libraries rather than only framing themselves in terms of challenges. And so that's kind of an issue that we'll return to discuss more in our conclusion. Our third finding was that participants were hesitant to widely and publicly share data. So collecting quite a bit of data, as we're finding, some of that data is quite relevant, and yet sometimes these library systems are hesitant to share those data publicly. This graph summarizes how data is shared. Data tend to be widely shared internally, for example, with the ministry, and also to select external organizations that the library systems have a relationship with. However, fewer than half of the library systems that we surveyed openly or publicly share their data. So open meaning they share it totally openly with anyone, publicly meaning targeting groups within their country's public. This may make data and the libraries less visible to new potential publics or new potential partners, because that data isn't open and easily available to members of the public or organizations that the library system doesn't already have a relationship with. So that's something to consider. Of course, library systems do have their reasons for not sharing data in this open fashion. Another question asked participants to describe the benefits and risks of data sharing. And as you can see in this slide, they did have a bit more in terms of variety of different risks that may, in their mind, outweigh some of the benefits of sharing data. So in terms of perceived benefits of sharing data, the answers were quite consistent with kind of the overall message of this ALVA webinar series, that data sharing can increase the visibility of libraries, that it can help libraries establish new partnerships, and that data sharing can also benefit users by, for example, increasing awareness of services or increasing advocacy to expand services for users. On the other side, they mentioned a whole range of different risks that they associate with sharing data. So a lot of those risks are associated with misuse of data. So libraries and library systems are fearful of ways in which the data they share may be misused for purposes that negatively impact the library or their users. So for example, a fear that it will fall into the wrong hands and be used for the wrong purpose. The second one is a fear that it can actually have negative repercussions in terms of their long-term funding. So this participant indicated that resources are very scarce in their country. If we're able to attract help resources from an organization that is politically affiliated to an opposition party, the ruling party may blacklist them. So in other words, successful use of data can still be harmful in the long run because they anger some other government party. Another user or another participant indicated that interpretation of the data out of context may harm the library and create confusion in the minds of the public in general, and more particularly of their stakeholders. So fearful that if they share it openly, people will misunderstand the data and misuse it. Other participants mentioned risks associated with loss of privacy, in particular loss of privacy for their patrons about whom the data is collected, fears around crediting data sources and fears around crediting data sources properly. 4 of our respondents did find that there was no risk to sharing data, so they fell more on the benefits side of data sharing. All of this means that any sort of solution to increasing the visibility of data, for example, data sharing platforms, must be carefully designed to mitigate all of these concerns and risks associated with sharing data. However, at the end of the day, it also means that libraries and library systems may have to make difficult decisions about whether becoming more visible is worth some of these risks associated with sharing data. And so this is obviously a decision that library systems themselves have to make in terms of that cost-benefit analysis around risks versus benefits of data sharing. Renee.
Thank you, Jason. I'll now address the second major group of our findings, which relates to the current data needs, and then we'll talk more about connections between the development organization interviews and current data practices of African libraries. The major finding within our seeking to know more about the current needs is that more training and support is needed in the analysis and dissemination of data, as well as general ICT use. So this was drawn from asking our participants about their challenges currently within their data collection practices and data use practices. So those challenges generally fell into 2 categories, logistical and infrastructural, to which 11 participants talked about challenges within that vein. So these could include things like a lack of internet and or electricity, either at their library specifically or more broadly within the library system. Inadequate funding for that library, a lack of tools for data collection and analysis, and other challenges related to the logistics or infrastructure of the library system. Another large portion of the challenges fell under the category of staff-related challenges, and these would be things including insufficient numbers of staff, limited technical and data management skills, or a delayed response in reporting data as it is required, or analyzing and sharing it if there is a timeline involved or a regular schedule of data collection. When we asked about what skills would be needed for library staff, you can see here there's quite a range, and this reflects the complexity and also the specificity of the needs within each library system that really should be taken into account when talking about possible training to address some of these needs. So some of the skills that our participants reported were on the basic ICT or information and communication technology skills level. These included things such as computer appreciation and the fundamentals of data literacy. And beyond that, data analysis. So things that fell into this category would be basic training in statistics, data interpretation skills, the use of Excel and data manipulation and spreadsheet statistics, but then also data collection, specific to technical and online methods, more training needed in both of those types of methods. And then also data presentation skills related to translating data from its raw form into something with more meaning, reporting that data, and also disseminating that data to the wider publics or to external stakeholders such as NGOs. So this represents a really broad set of needs. And importantly, I'd like to return back to the number that we quoted earlier, that only 55% of the participants reported that training is provided to data collectors or reporters prior to collection or reporting. So for some of the participants, there is absolutely no training, and so that needs to be taken into account, whereas for other participants, we may be trying to target more complex skills for those who already have a basic level in terms of data collection, analysis, and sharing. I'd like to share this quote that mentions some important points from one of our participants who says, "The training must include the construction of these by means of computers as well as harmonization with the models universally applied in this area without neglecting the need to include specific data in our country." And we think this is an important addition to highlight because it says that libraries, or it intimates that libraries may not have much agency to implement drastic change, that they're working within their own system of their government or within their library ministry. Any training needs to respect that they are part of a wider system, and the data needs and the processes depend highly on the context, whether that's a context of the country, the context of the surroundings of that library, if it's urban, rural. We're really looking at a very complex picture of what is needed on the ground. So now I'll move on to the last section, which is dealing with connections between the library data and data practices and what development organizations want. So this is bringing together the webinar from last week, as well as information that we've just talked about now. So one of the important connections is that the survey suggests that libraries already have some of the data that development organizations want. Specifically, that's quantitative data, numbers or statistics on the users, the programs, and the facilities of libraries, and also demographic data on users. And this really is great news, because what it means is that we can focus more on making that data visible, or creating ways to make that data more accessible to those who would like to partner with African libraries. But two potential areas of disconnect that are worth mentioning are: the first, that library systems may not be aware of the full value of impact data specifically in attracting partnerships, or may not feel capable assessing impact. So this echoes what we heard in the development organization interviews, that impact data is in fact a holy grail. It's very difficult to collect, and so often output data is used to make a case for impact. However, the participants who responded to our survey didn't bring up impact data as much as we thought it would. And also, given the skills that are needed or mentioned to be needed, that impact data or creating a story of impact from output would be something important to address in terms of the gaps that currently exist. Secondly, another area of disconnect would be that library systems may be overemphasizing their needs instead of their successes to potential partners, such as development organizations. So this is important because last week we had talked about how development organizations wanted flexible partners, those who are capable, those who are functional, those who have a track record of success and who can contribute to a development project. And this may be different from how library systems are currently presenting themselves to external partners, such as NGOs or other types of development organizations. And so in that case, there might be a shift in marketing or a shift in messaging that's needed from African libraries to present themselves as capable, presenting their successes, and creating a track record for themselves with their own data, so that they can present themselves in that capable, functional way that development organizations may be looking for. So we have a couple of next steps that we could provide or suggest in order to meet some of these areas of disconnect. First of all, there could be a platform or an adjustment to an existing platform to make that data that is already collected more visible. So some of the possibilities for those types of data that could be made more visible would include average visitors per day, week, month, year, with the unit chosen by the library according to their current data collection practice and the regularity that they collect that data. The average visitor age and average percentage of visitors by gender. These two would be picking up on the fact that development organizations are interested in targeting specific populations, often those who are marginalized. Also, the number of visitors attending with their most recent or specified program chosen by the library. So this would get at the public or the community involvement piece that development organizations are interested in, and then the operational data, including these 5 types of most commonly collected operational data that we have mentioned previously. And this would highlight the fact that libraries have resources, they have space that can be used or utilized in development projects. And then last but not least, impact data. And this could include links to the library's most recent annual report or an impact assessment if they have that available. And of course, another possible next step could be more training to empower libraries to analyze and disseminate their own data on their terms, emphasizing impacts. So as put beautifully by one of the participants, they said, my organization needs to have a way of disseminating the data to the public and other organizations. Data should be readily available if needed by external entities. The country's National Library Service needs to align data collection with development strategies in order to provide relevant services. So this really brings together the types of needs that were expressed in this survey, as well as the opportunities that they present for the future. And overall, what we would like to highlight as a result of the responses to the survey is that data can be agency. So we've already seen that the African library systems in this survey value data. They collect it according to systems. There are already practices in place. They do, or at least have reported in the survey, that a variety of data is available. And so any movement forward can harness that potential of the data and make sure that these concerns about data sharing are addressed, and also give African library systems the skills that they need in order to analyze and create their own stories according to the data that they have available and the stories that they want to tell about their library system to continue to benefit the communities that they're a part of. Thank you very much for your attention. I believe that we have time for questions and comments. There are already some that are in the chat, so I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Sam, to facilitate that.
Jason for the presentation, and even though I'm part of the team from this presentation, and I believe that the participants have also enjoyed very much the presentation and taken a few things from the presentation. There are a couple of questions that have come in, but let me, will be posted to them at the end of the series, and they are also to subscribe to the AFLIA YouTube page so that when there are any updates, they will receive the presentations. One question that I think was posted on the Facebook is this, that given perceived risks and benefits relative to sharing library data publicly and widely, what, in your opinion, should be the way to go? Does the perceived risks of sharing library data really outweigh the perceived benefits?
That's great. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a wonderful and really important question. To some degree, my answer may be a little unsatisfactory, because I'm going to say it probably depends. On the one hand, we're working within the Advancing Library Visibility in Africa project. So generally, we have kind of a strong feeling that it is important to increase the visibility of African libraries, and that one important step in advancing that visibility, expanding that visibility, is making more visible the things that libraries are doing And we can do that by sharing these data that describe those activities. So a lot of the emphasis of the ALVA project really has been geared towards providing libraries with tools that can make data more open, more visible, more available. And we're hearing from development organizations that they want to be able to see those data. So we think that there's really strong benefits to making data more openly available. I'll also say in other locations around the world, in the United States, for example, within the field of library and information science, there's a very strong movement towards open data, so publicly available, openly available data. And most of the science in those locations indicate that the benefits of open data are quite impactful, quite important. At the same time, we recognize that you know, there are very different kind of social and political realities across different countries, and you know, and that certainly is the case across the many different African countries that we've surveyed. And so some of the risks that you know, these library systems are describing are quite real and can be quite negatively impactful. And so, you know, one of the participants, we mentioned this quote where they can actually, you know, you can face political repercussions, funding repercussions for sharing data. And that is perhaps because the country more widely perhaps has kind of a data culture that can punish the sharing of data. And so if that is kind of the local context, one, maybe those risks are more substantial, and so one may have to reconsider whether the benefits are worth it. But secondly, I think there's kind of a compromise in that we need to collectively, we as a community, we need to be developing tools and training and platforms that allow us to be more strategic about how we share these data, so that we're sharing them openly in ways that kind of don't fall victim to the risks, but do really emphasize some of the benefits of sharing data. So hopefully that's kind of, when Renee talks about next steps, that's one of the things that we're working towards. Sir, Renee, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or
in a word or two, what assurance can you give to people that in spite of all these perceived risk, we should still share data?
It's difficult to summarize because, as Jason has mentioned, there's a lot of a variety on the ground in terms of the repercussions of sharing data. And something else that we had talked about in last week's webinar was the concern about exposing users or making them vulnerable if data about them is shared, especially marginalized populations. So I think really the decision should be in the hand of the library systems. Hello, Dr. Joel. I can hear you, but not see you.
Hello?
Hello. But as I was saying, I do, and I believe that Jason also feels that the decision about whether or not to share data should be an informed one, and it should be a decision that's made locally according to the situation that the library systems know that they're working within. I believe that we have some questions in the Q&A, so I can address one of those.
All right, so Okay, since Dr. Sam is not here, I'll take over from here. I am Doreen. All right, there are two questions here. The first question is, what are some of the examples of SDG/NDP related indicators that the data is collected for? That is one. The second one is, in the findings, data use, what is the difference between government advocacy and external advocacy? What are the advocacy targets for external advocacy? Those are the two questions. So if you can address that one.
Yes. Thank you, Doreen, and thank you, Christine, for the questions. I'll talk about the first one first. What are some of the examples of SDG, NDP related indicators that the data is collected for? Unfortunately, our survey asked in the general sense and not in the specific sense of which indicators are included in that category. However, some that we can imagine might be the numbers of marginalized populations that are accessing the library, such as youth, such as women, which is often included as part of the SDG goals, and national development plans, or NDPs, in order to create more inclusive development in the countries.
We did, Renee, if I could jump in, we did actually, we had well, we didn't have a question kind of with specific categories of sustainable development goals. We did have one question that had an open text field where individual participants could respond with the types of development related data that they collect. And in our analysis of that field, we had kind of two common areas emerge from our analysis. One is actually precisely what Renee was imagining might be the case. So one of the common themes was collecting development data focused on local communities, such as access needs of marginalized populations, the number of local health centers, so looking at kind of health sustainable development goals, and the availability of electricity and other utilities that may be kind of a proxy indicator of development in the area, so kind of infrastructure. Even more common, though, was a theme around collection of data to support education development goals. And so we had at least 8 respondents mention education-related data points, such as the number of schools in a given area, the number of books given to schools, and programs to support reading and digital literacy. So that kind of direct impact that libraries are having on education and literacy related development goals.
Great,
All right.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for
and
the.
I'm also happy. Sorry, Doreen, go ahead.
Okay, so that's for the first question. Then the second question, in the findings, data use, what is the difference between government advocacy and external advocacy? And what are the targets, advocacy targets for external advocacy? So please, if you can address that one.
Yeah, that's great. So we're kind of thinking here as government kind of being internal to the government of which these library systems are a part. And then external, it's focused more on external organizations, so external to that government, such as non-governmental organizations. Development organizations would fall within that category. Private funders, basically any organization outside of that country's government that libraries may turn to for some sort of material support, for example. So primarily, I think our participants were thinking of non-governmental organizations when responding to those questions.
All right, thank you. I think those two questions have been answered. So far, we had 3 questions and they've all been answered. So Dr. Sam is back. Dr. Sam, can you please take over from here? Thank you. Hello, Dr. Sam. All right. So there's a comment is just to thank you for answering the question on SDGs. I think we don't have much questions. And I would like at this time to remind participants that we will send the presentations to all of them, and the video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can check it from there. You can also reach any of the researchers. As you can see, the information is on the screen. You can reach any of them, and if you have any further question, you go there and then ask them or send them your questions. So thank you for coming. And I would like to remind you that a week today, that will be on the 14th, there's going to be the last part of this series. And the topic or the title will be, is a panel discussion, and it's going to be recommendations from the ALVA project. So kindly try as much as you can to join us next week. And don't forget the time. It will be the same time, 12 o'clock GMT and 1 o'clock West African time, 2 o'clock South Africa. And that will be it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to say thank you to the audience. Thank you to all our wonderful partners at AFLIA, as well as all of our in-country librarian partners. It's been just a real pleasure working with you all and presenting some of the findings, and hopefully folks found it useful. So have a great rest of your day.
Yes, thank you. I'll echo Jason and thanking everyone for being here. And we look forward to hearing more next week from our panelists, who will provide some more perspective on the things that we've been saying as a result of our research. So please do tune in. Thank you.